So, of course, springtime is known for wildflowers coming into bloom. This, I think you can see some of the wildflowers. They're just starting to bloom. These are beautiful little wildflower called Virginia bluebells. And what's interesting about the Virginia bluebell, as with a lot of the spring flowers, they have a very brief season. They only bloom for about 2 to 3 weeks, and I'll never forget. I've been walking these woods and exploring our family farm as pretty much as long as I can remember. But one day, it was while I was in college about 25 years ago, about this time of year, I was walking past this hillside that I've walked past many times before, and I turned the corner and I smelled the aroma of the flowers, and then I turned another corner and I just see just this beautiful display of purple and pink and light blue flowers just all along this hillside. As you can see, they're quite abundant along this hillside, and I ran back to my grandmother's house and just felt like I'd made this amazing discovery. And I get back to my grandmother's house and I said, "Grandmother," I said, "I found these beautiful." She's like, "Yeah, that's Bluebell Hill." And I was like, "Well, how come you haven't told me about Bluebell Hill?" It was just truly fascinating to me, and it kind of reminds me of just how our ancestors and whether it's the pioneers or Native Americans or just our own grandparents and great-grandparents, just the wealth of knowledge that they have, and what I wouldn't give to just have another 5 or 10 minutes with my grandmother to ask her questions and for her to impart some of her years of wisdom and all the things that she knows. But as you can see, one thing that I think is really interesting about this population of Virginia bluebells is every so often you have an albino. Albinoism is present in many organisms, both plants and animals. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more this 9 weeks as we talk about evolution. And then obviously we've talked about how albinoism relates to genetics in a sense that it is a recessive gene, and two recessive alleles come together, an expression of that color, that trait, and we can look at the frequency of the alleles in this population. There's actually an equation, the Hardy-Weinberg equation. If we are making the assumption that this population of Virginia bluebells is in an evolutionary equilibrium, and we're going to talk more about that a little bit later, we can actually use this population of Virginia bluebells, and we could do a population survey or a population count of the Virginia bluebells in relationship to the albino version, and use those proportions to determine the number of alleles. Basically, what we would determine, obviously, the white Virginia bluebells have both recessive alleles. You might say 2 little n's, and so they would be homozygous recessive, would be their genotype. Their phenotype is the physical characteristic. It's what we can see. They're white. But we can also know the genotype, the genetic makeup of the white Virginia bluebells, because we know that it's recessive. Now, the blue Virginia bluebells, on the other hand, we don't know by looking at that bluebell whether it's heterozygous or homozygous dominant. If you remember, we talked about that quite a bit with genetics, because the phenotype, the physical characteristic, is blue, but the genotype, it's not displayed. We can't tell if it's dominant or if it's heterozygous. But with the Hardy-Weinberg equation, it will help us to determine the frequency or the number in this population that are carrying that recessive gene. So it would help us to identify not only the obvious homozygous recessive, the white flowers, It would help us to distinguish what percent of the blue flowers are heterozygous and what percent of the blue flowers are homozygous dominant. Now, if we had class time and we had time together in class, we would actually work out the Hardy-Weinberg equation using the Virginia bluebells and maybe some other organisms as examples. That's going to be a little more challenging for us to do in the virtual world, but at least wanted you to understand the principle behind how math and how science work together to help us to understand the great mystery of the creation.